I know no one gives a shit about this explanation, but let me explain nonetheless. So originally this was gonna be one big video where I cover all 3 games. Unfortunately, things happened, and by things I mean for some reason I didn't download what I was talking about for the first part of Rise of the Tomb Raider. Now the other recordings are still fine, but the Rise of the Tomb Raider bit, which is 2 minutes worth of audio for that specific segment, guess it just didn't download, I don't know. So basically decided to just take that one part of the video, the first third, make it a whole video in itself, and it did relatively decently, so I guess I shouldn't be too sad about it, but it is kind of annoying anyway. Doesn't matter because now I'm recording the rest of this, so yeah, I mean, this is gonna be the last video, so enjoy, and Merry Christmas, I guess. Fuck off. With the success of Tomb Raider 2013, a sequel was obviously going to be greenlit. Now, for both old and new fans, this had a lot of potential for improving upon the first game. Old fans speculated that this would finally be the moment where Lara steps out of that scared, vulnerable spot she was in for most of the first game, so she can finally become the badass that she was in the older games. New fans wanted this to be the Uncharted 2 to 2013's Uncharted 1. Meanwhile, I hadn't played the game yet until 3 years later and forgot about it for a while, but now in the year of our Lord 2025, I've replayed this game after a decade from its release, and all I have to say is Rise is definitely more my speed compared to 2013. Now it's far from perfect, and even has some parts where I actually think it's worse than 2013, like the story for example, but we'll get into that later. However, this game is a giant improvement from the last game in so many ways on a gameplay level, even if that's not really perfect either. But even if it's not a total masterpiece, I still think that it does what 2013 does considerably better. For one, combat feels a lot smoother than the last game as far as how good it feels and your strategy. It's still the same control-wise, and it sadly doesn't really have a run and gun mechanic either, but the weapons just feel better. It also helps that you're much faster in this game because you have a sprint button. I know some Halo fans are typing some wild shit as they hear me say this. All of this mixed with a generally better gunplay than the first game makes this so much more fun. I even had more fun upgrading the weapons, which I barely did in the first game, as it felt more utilitarian to me. Upgrading to different types of arrows and shotgun shells was actually engaging because the results were always pretty fun. Now I obviously didn't get every single upgrade, but I upgraded enough to where I could pretty much go crazy with it. You feel more fast in combat and way more powerful. And while a lot of veteran Tomb Raider fans didn't exactly love this, I think that for what the series was going for, it's pretty fun. It's a much snappier version of the last game, and that's how I describe it. Even the stealth is so much better, which I rarely mentioned in the last game because it felt like kind of an afterthought there. It's not that it didn't exist, it was just kind of forgettable. In Rise, I feel like the stealth is a lot better, and the improved weapons make sure of this. You can craft different types of arrows, light things on fire, make mini grenades, which makes it even more fun. What also helps stealth is a lot of the new movement tech, which isn't exactly groundbreaking, and it honestly leaves a lot to be desired, but it helps. The new rope swing stuff is a little jank, but I think once you unlock all of it and start using it more during set pieces and in combat, it's much more fun to chain between pressing square to swing, then to wall jump or zipping or whatever else. Pretty much never got old for me personally. I think Uncharted 4 took those rope mechanics and definitely did something better with those, but hey, this game came out in 2015, that game came out in 2016, and was doing a completely different thing. The Uncharted 4 comparisons will be in a different part of this video, don't worry. The puzzles were pretty decent too, which I neglected talking about for the last game because I'm not the biggest fan of puzzles in most action games. I also felt that the puzzles were mostly pretty forgettable in 2013. However, I do appreciate the more logic-centric puzzles and physics-based ones in Rise. I'm sure some old fans wish there was more of this stuff, but I think the campaign had enough to not make the combat and traversal feel too monotonous. Honestly, despite the fact that this game is much better than Tomb Raider 2013 though, I don't really have much to say on this game as far as gameplay goes. It's just 2013 but better, and I think it succeeds in that regard. I think the only things I'd say is that there are some problems from the first game carried over, like the cover system and the supernatural enemies being way too easy, but I didn't really care because so much of it was better. I think the only downgrade for me personally was probably the fact that some of the set pieces weren't as creative or as fun or memorable, but I guess I can excuse that because I like the core gameplay enough. Also, fuck this water segment. Now we're gonna talk about the story, which is probably the worst thing of all these games, but of course, I'll just give a brief synopsis. So this game begins in Medea's Res, with Lara climbing up a mountain with Jonah, of all people, to find the lost city of Katesh because apparently her dad researched this place or something, I don't fucking know. The series puts way more emphasis on her father's research from this game to the next, so be prepared for that. Anyway, Katesh had something important about the immortal soul that her dad wanted to research, but the organization Trinity had been leeching off his research while also framing him as crazy. This causes him to seemingly kill himself, which then gets retconned in the next game, but whatever, I'm getting ahead of myself. This all leads to Lara heading to Siberia, but things get fucked up up, and Lara gets the book with the research stolen, which leads us back to the opening where they're climbing the mountain and they get separated via avalanche. Lara survives, gets betrayed by this bitch who's really sick and also used to fuck Lara's dad or something, and then meets some dude named Jacob who's revealed to be some immortal guy who's the leader of this tribe called the Deathless, who've gone mad after having no guidance for like a really long time, and they're also protecting this thing called the Divine Source, which Trinity wants to use for immortality. You then engage in a terrible boss fight, then you destroy the source, and the game ends with a dull monologue. Yeah, I think this plot is actually a lot worse than the 2013 game in so many ways, but I wouldn't have such a problem with it if I liked all the character stuff. So many of the characters like last time are just bland and one note. Thankfully, the game doesn't try to shove as many characters in as possible that you don't care about, but the ones that exist aren't exactly well written or developed either. Like, there's that one girl who hates Lara for being an outsider and her arc is slowly accepting you, and yeah, it's really bland and rushed and forced. Also, Jonah's tagging along for the ride instead of Sam for some reason. I get that Sam was probably traumatized by the events of the last game, but she was like the closest friend to Lara. Jonah very much felt like an extra in the last game, and he didn't really feel that important besides defending Lara sometimes, I guess. Then you have Jacob, who's just as boring, but he's more plot relevant and a messiah or something. I'm aware the old games in the last game did a bunch of gun jumpy shit, but the way they handle supernatural concepts is just so annoyingly convoluted and dumb here. The villains are as boring as last time, but at least they have a motive, unlike the last one. My main issue with them is that, again, they're boring and have little to no charisma, and like the main bad guy's sister is sick or something. They're just not interesting. As much as we shit on Uncharted villains, at least Lazarevich was comically evil to the point he was fun in Uncharted 2, and Raven 4 was a different side of the same coin as Nate as far as him and his love for finding treasure. The ones in these games just don't have that going for them, and they're just dull and don't really do anything all that interesting or smart or threatening. By far the most damning part of this plot is actually Lara herself, and more specifically the plot with her dead dad. Lara isn't a terrible character in this, but she is bland and has not that much to her in this. The plot with her dad, on the other hand, is just really unsubtle and beaten into your skull to the point it's annoying. This gets even worse in the next game, but again, we'll get to that when we get to that. It's not even a bad idea narratively, but the story doesn't really make me care about any of it. What I mean is that the story is so fast-paced and has no time to really develop itself, but when it tries too hard to make me care, and I just don't. I get what the story wants to say. Lara shouldn't be following her dad's legacy that closely, but at the same time, maybe spend more time on it while not making the interactions and mentions of his problems as subtle as a brick to the face. It's a mostly uninteresting part of the plot that this game insists is really deep and complex, but it's really not. It doesn't help that all the characters have about as much chemistry as pencils on sandpaper. I think overall the story is the worst part of the whole game, and from here on out it just gets worse. At least it was a good excuse for set pieces and gameplay, but it's still a rather thin excuse at this point. You'd think that this one would have Lara grow a bit more into that badass from the older games, but she feels somewhat the same as she did in like the second to last act of the first game, if anything. The plot is dull and the characters are boring, which isn't saying a whole lot, but I think if you played this game, you'd have little to write home about it. It doesn't really have the fun deconstructive arc in the first game, and it's more of don't let your ancestry define you, which would be fine if it was handled well. I think that despite the story being quite fucking terrible, Rise of the Tomb Raider is actually pretty damn good. Is it amazing? No, but it's considerably more fun than the first game. Honestly, all they need to do is keep it the same, fix some of the remaining issues with the gameplay, and then they can move forward in stride. Or they can just not do that, I guess. So development for the third entry in the Tomb Raider Survivor trilogy was already off to a really weird start. Crystal Dynamics handed a majority of the third game's development off to Eidos Montreal, as they were assigned to just be minor support on the game and working on the Avengers project. In hindsight, this is even worse than I could have ever imagined. It's not exactly that Eidos are bad at developing games or anything, as they have a good track record with games like Deus Ex, and even supported Crystal Dynamics on the other Tomb Raider games. But switching talent at this point in the franchise was just really off. Now, it's not like there wasn't really anything to get excited about when this game was confirmed. It promised older Tomb Raider fans that they would finally get a more badass Lara that's more akin to the original version of herself, promising that for this one, she might actually become the real Lara Croft that the fans knew and loved, and the other games were just pump fakes. They even announced that there was a de-emphasis on combat, which got a lot of older fans excited, although this should have been the first red flag, but I'll get to that later, don't you worry. So with all that hype, was the game any good? No, I think it's actually the worst one in the entire trilogy. I might have to call this one a genuinely bad game. I've played many bad games, even some worse than this, and while this game isn't special in how bad it is, it's still miserable and excruciating to play from beginning to end. It doesn't matter whether you want to focus on the story or the gameplay, everything about the game is just painfully boring. I'll just get the story out of the way first, because while it's really bad, there's even less to say about it. The stories in these recent games have obviously not been very good so far. 2013 had little context for its characters and world building, and Rise had a convoluted, nonsensical plot. But Shadow commits the worst sin by both being uninteresting, yet also undermining the previous aspects of other games. It's so uninteresting that I don't even care to recap what happens, because again, I don't care. Not to mention all the times where we cut back and forth between flashbacks, especially towards the climax. It's just terrible. It happened a little in the last game, but it wasn't nearly as annoying. Here it feels tedious, especially since you have to straight up play one segment, which I'll get to when I get to the gameplay segment. The other thing that's been somewhat of a topic of controversy here is Lara's characterization and really just anything to do with her. She begins the game more weirdly reckless than usual, which wouldn't be so bad as she didn't already grow from it in the last game, because that literally got her in several bad spots beforehand. I get that characters are supposed to make mistakes, but it gets to a point where the mistakes in the beginning of this game make her character feels like she hasn't really grown at all from the last two games. What's even funnier is that in the beginning, she steals a dagger that basically makes an apocalyptic flood happen, and she somehow becomes more selfish and doesn't care about helping the victims of the flood, as if she didn't literally go out of her way to help people in the last few games. It's just so contrived, and what's even funnier is that the game pretty much forgets about that entire first part right after the argument between her and Jonah, who still does nothing useful at all, but whatever. There's nothing wrong with a character acting dumb or even deconstructing a character after growth, but there's just no good narrative reason to make Lara this stupid. And for what? To teach themes of hubris and ego? As soon as she gets to Paititi or whatever, she basically more or less reverts back to who she was in the last few games and starts helping people again. I'd be okay with that if Lara clearly learned from the first scene of the game, instead of them just fading to black because they remembered they did a shitty In Medea's Res scene that doesn't make any fucking sense, by the way, because it's literally just a plane crash that happens right after the tutorial level and serves no other point other than to separate Lara and Jonah again for 30 minutes. At least Rise separated them for longer once we actually caught up to the In Medea's Res opener. That aside, as soon as the plane crashes, everything about the story and even the gameplay just becomes so boring. Lara lands near an ancient lost civilization and even has a somewhat standoffish relationship with some of the tribe members, like in Rise, and it's so boring and derivative of the last game. Even ignoring that, Lara's transformation to becoming the Tomb Raider we've all been waiting for is just so underwhelming by the time it happens anyway. The defining moment where she gets separated from Jonah has some cool spectacle, I guess, but it's so dull because we don't really feel that internal change outside of, well, the external. Lara never really fights within herself or anything about it. She just reacts to external conflict, and that's boring. Speaking of boring, wow, this game is paced horribly in both story and gameplay. Obviously story first, because we'll get into gameplay soon enough, don't you worry. And specifically talking about how the story itself is paced, there's a big opening sequence with the flood, and after that we end up back in the Medea's Res opening, and then after that the game decides it wants to be really slow until the very end where they decide to care about gameplay. There's nothing wrong with a slow burn type of story, even in an open world game like this, but it gets to a point where, again, it's just uninteresting. Lara is out here trudging through an admittedly decent flood sequence, and then for the rest of the game, it's basically just talking to people and going to tombs, which makes sense because this is Tomb Raider, but it's not that fun. I think the developers took this part way too far, but again, I'll talk about that later. I feel like I'm just losing my mind listing random things that I dislike about the story, but this plot and its characters are just so genuinely void of any personality or charm that I can't coherently write this. Everything about the storytelling feels completely wrong. Even things that had potential, like the villain, who was actually somewhat nuanced this time around. He didn't want to harness the power of a god for the sake of power like other villains, but because he believed that he could actually protect the civilization of Paititi from the outside world. The problem? Well, Dominguez here isn't really given all that much to do. and he gets completely overshadowed by this shitty apocalypse plot and gets taken down like a bitch in the climax with a boss fight that feels both too short and too long, and it feels anticlimactic for what's supposed to be effectively the end of the series. This entire story is just so diabolically terrible in every way besides maybe a few cool looking set pieces and some nice graphics and some good voice acting. But that's supposed to be the given, not something worth praising, at least not as much as good writing, characters, and pacing. Since there's so much more to be bored by, let's now talk about the gameplay. And at first, I was actually willing to say it's not terrible. You have all your weapons in the tutorial mission, and I'll admit that part was somewhat fun, ignoring the scripted bits. Sure, it won't be as good as the other two games, but that part was well done and even has a cool action set piece moment. The problem is that the rest of the game is really boring. Okay, before I talk about anything else, I'm going to bring up a game that came about 2 years prior. So, Uncharted 4, right? It decided to be less conventional and decrease the amount of combat and action bits in service of the platforming, puzzles, and storytelling. While this lack of focus on shootouts in 4 compared to the other Uncharted games was controversial, I think it actually helped 4 in the long run. See, Uncharted 4's de-emphasis on combat wasn't really to cater to anyone, nor did it make the game seemingly less fun. It was done more so to make sure combat was less exhausting and that the spectacle moments were a result of quality over quantity, along with the fact that it just told a good story and has some good puzzles and platforming. Shout out to Tomb Raider's de-emphasis on combat may have been a great thing to make Tomb Raider fans get hyped, but it severely backfires. I would be completely on board with all of this if the puzzles and exploration weren't boring. The biggest culprit of this external boredom is the movement, which despite having more options is worse. It's not worse because its control's worse, it's worse because it's more boring. In Rise you could straight up parkour, jumping from trees and rocks like a third-person Mirror's Edge. And here it's just climbing and mild slow swinging to the very end because there's no flow with the movement. And that's just when you're playing outside, and it makes it feel so hard to want to explore because it's just so unentertaining. I didn't care to explore any environments in the previous games that much, but I had fun moving around them and within them. I can't even enjoy that anymore. Going into the rooms is even more boring because the puzzles are just bland as hell rather than anything. I'm glad that they tried their hand at logic-based puzzles again, but that doesn't change how boring they are here. They're just so forgettable, and they were like that in the other games too, but they also weren't a common occurrence in comparison. Again, all of this emphasis on puzzles over combat would have been fine if the puzzles were actually, I don't know, good. Hey, maybe the little combat there actually is makes up for it and is actually good. Well, it's definitely not unenjoyable, I guess. I'll just be straightforward and say that the close quarters combat in this game is probably the weakest in this entire series. It just feels like Eidos copied what the last two games did, but without the power, the bravado, and the sauce. Yeah, I'm firing the same weapons as last time, but there's no impact, no punch. The shotgun especially feels more like shooting a gun with balloon animals for ammo, rather than a dangerous weapon that could kill someone. Even the bullet spread issue from the first few games with a rifle still isn't fixed, and now it's both inaccurate and doesn't feel like anything at all. All the weapons just feel flaccid without any of the visual or audio feedback from 2013, or let alone Rise, which damn near perfected that. Also, yes, melee combat still sucks, but at least stealth has more options, I guess. I actually think mechanically, this game probably has the best stealth in the new series. There are actually plenty of cool things you can do, camo mechanic that's actually really fun and somewhat addresses the cover problem I mentioned beforehand, and even more tools for cool takedowns. I think my main issue is that combat in general is such an infrequency that it's hard to notice stuff like this. It's a shame because these are pretty great mechanics and in the story. I think that there just aren't enough encounters to take advantage of this fully. I mean, sure, the AI is still stupid, but it is still fun. Maybe this game is an Arkham Knight or Devil May Cry 4 case where the campaign is really bad, but the combat challenges in the post-game are great. The problem is that I don't really like the close quarters combat in this game, unlike the games I mentioned. Also, what dipshit actually approved of this skill tree? What the hell am I looking at? Also, by the time I was in the middle of the game, I was already feeling this game's length, as the gameplay pacing is just so terrible. Like I said in the story segment, you get to the part with the big flood set piece, and then you're in the jungle, and afterwards you're just slowly traversing the world or walking, and if you're lucky, you may have some combat to break the monotony, but even that's underbaked. I just started to feel the length of this game, which shouldn't be possible, because my playthrough was about 9 or 10 hours long, which is considerably shorter than even Uncharted 4, but again, that game is more fun than this and had a better story. Even if that game focused more on its story over the shootouts, the moments of downtime with characters was actually entertaining. Even puzzles were somewhat interesting, and the action was really fun. Compared to Shadow of the Tomb Raider, where they don't even know how to properly transition into an action set piece without it feeling awkward, because you just got done with 5 hours of walking and doing puzzles with the most boring characters ever. Shadow of the Tomb Raider was just so frustrating because I wanted to like it a whole lot. I was okay with the promise of a slower game that focused more on its puzzles over combat, because that's what the series was supposed to be, right? I think the issue was exclusively the execution rather than the idea. I personally don't prefer puzzles to combat in games, but for this series that's well known for its puzzles and exploration, I was willing to put up with it. But instead, I got the worst parts of several AAA single-player games. Tons of moments where I'm just walking and talking with characters I don't care about, core combat that's less punchy than prior games, and a story that's just terrible. Shadow is an unmitigated disaster for this franchise, and I really hope that if they want this series to come back, they don't just promise the old fans the idea of something better, and instead actually deliver, because this is the worst way to go out. It's a damn shame. Well, I guess that ending speech was pointless.